From 1925 until 1945, Benito Mussolini, an Italian political figure, ruled Italy as a fascist dictator. Known as Il Duce, the leader, Mussolini established a dictatorship after abandoning the facade of democracy in 1925 and ruling under the constitution. Since Mussolini was the main architect of the ideology, his contribution to fascism is noteworthy. He started the fascist movement in Italy in 1919. Shortly, it had grown into the Partito Nazionale Fascista, or National Fascist Party. Mussolini gained support among middle class and veterans of the war by taking advantage of the widespread anxieties about communism and labor unrest. Mussolini's fascism denied that the majority could rule human civilization and opposed democracy. Mussolini said that nations endure while political ideas change, rejecting earlier models. Though many fascists, including Mussolini himself, held racist beliefs that were codified into law as official policy during fascist control, anti-Semitism was not initially the ideology of fascism in Italy. His charm and ability to persuade people were very important in his rise to power. To garner support, he employed a strong combination of brutality, nationalism, and populism. His oratory was a dramatic performance meant to instill confidence in his administration. Mussolini also used visual arts, theater, and the media to his advantage in establishing a customized system of government. Essentially, Mussolini served as the main planner and implementer of fascism. During the interwar years, his policies and tactics prepared the ground for subsequent fascist leaders and movements.
This is the Sundeep Show.
In the spring of 1929, he created a High Commission for the Press. Strict censorship regulations were enacted by Mussolini's regime, enabling government authorities to examine and filter all broadcast and printed material. Before being distributed, publications had to follow tight regulations and obtain official approval. Many media organizations and journalists engaged in rigorous self-censorship out of concern for retaliation from the government. They avoided critical reporting on the regime and controversial subjects. The government created a climate of fear that prevented independent reporting and opposition by using secret police and surveillance to keep an eye on journalists and editors. Editors and writers of independent newspapers and publications that defied Nazi doctrine were frequently punished or imprisoned, and many publications were shut down. The government mandated that all forms of media, including newspapers and radio stations, get the necessary authorizations before beginning operations. This gave the government a way to exercise influence and control over the organizations that were allowed to operate. Important media organizations, including the official news agency, newspapers, and radio stations, came under the direct authority of the Italian government under Mussolini's rule. This made it possible for the regime to control the narrative and spread its propaganda. After 1924, the state took control of internal Italian radio transmissions and used them to air 2 hours of fascist programming every day. Propaganda was widely employed by the fascist administration to sway public opinion and keep control of the media. The government of Mussolini hired knowledgeable propagandists to create propaganda that praised the accomplishments of the state and propagated fascist ideology. The government of Mussolini exercised control over the educational system to guarantee that fascist beliefs and concepts were imparted to people. Future generations of residents and journalists were inspired by this. As part of a campaign against the free press, Mussolini's administration also mandated that cinema, theater screened propaganda newsreels. The goal of Mussolini's government was to destroy other news and information sources. It limited Italians' exposure to international viewpoints by regulating and restricting the dissemination of foreign newspapers and magazines. News organizations under the regime's control, like Agenzia Stefani, had a monopoly on supplying Italian newspapers with news. This made it possible for the government to sway the viewpoint and content of news reports. Journalists were urged to actively engage in the teaching and indoctrination of the Italian people, viewing their profession as one of many ways to serve the country. Fascism, according to Mussolini, requires militant journalism, in which the nation's publications present themselves as a solid block dedicated to the cause, while concealing or outright burying any fact or story that contradicted it. The Nationalist Fascist Union, a group that aimed to guarantee adherence to fascist philosophy and governmental objectives, was mandatory for journalists to join. A number of press rules were enacted by the regime, making it illegal to disparage the government or its officials. Prison time was among the potential punishments for journalists who criticized the administration. The propaganda that Mussolini's government inserted into the school system promoted fascist ideas and exalted the government. Textbooks were revised to promote nationalism, militarism, and the significance of the state in accordance with fascist ideology. Participation in groups such as the Piccole Italiane for girls and the Gioventù Italiana del Littorio GIL for boys was mandated by the regime. These groups indoctrinated youth with the party's ideology and advocated fascist ideas. Access to alternative views was further curtailed when books and other items were deemed critical of fascism were taken out of libraries and schools. Textbooks used in schools were severely restricted, and this practice intensified after 1936. A single government-approved history book replaced the previous 317 options, and schools were forced to use appropriate fascist textbooks. Academic publications and research were subject to censorship in order to enforce fascist ideology, and scholars whose stances diverged from those of the regime were punished with sanctions. Schools were utilized to track down and silence teachers or students who voiced disapproval. People who spoke out against fascism or did things to help the resistance were often reported and punished. The curriculum placed a great emphasis on patriotism and state allegiance, which helped to foster a sense of Italian nationalism and devotion to Mussolini. Curriculum modifications were implemented to place greater emphasis on the study of fascist doctrines, history, and the accomplishments of Mussolini's regime. The fascist narrative was supported by manipulating the way that literature and history were taught. Typically, fascists were appointed to important positions like head teachers. All educators, even those employed by universities, were required to take loyalty vows to the Il Duce, pledges of allegiance to the fascist regime, and the Il Duce were mandatory for educators. Mussolini prioritized athletics and military training in schools, especially for boys, and he promoted physical health. The idea behind this was to instill a sense of discipline and preparedness for battle. Military training and fascist values were taught by youth groups such as the Avanguardisti for girls and the Melilla for guys. These groups train youth to work for the state in the future. Mussolini's National Fascist Party challenged the established roles of Catholic associations and sports clubs by providing a wide range of clubs and service groups for young people aged 6 to 21. Mussolini's government also had an impact on cultural gatherings and celebrations, which were frequently employed as vehicles for propagating fascist beliefs and lauding the accomplishments of the dictatorship. The original fascist manifesto, co-authored by Mussolini and others in 1919, did not specifically mention racial legislation under Mussolini's fascist dictatorship in Italy. The main focus of the fascist manifesto was on the various political and economic tenets that defined fascism. Although racial issues were not specifically addressed, it placed a great emphasis on nationalism, authoritarianism, and the necessity of a powerful central authority. However, later in the 1930s and early 1940s, Mussolini's government enacted race legislation partly inspired by the racial policies of Nazi Germany. These laws, also referred to as Italian racial laws or legge razziali, were enacted between 1938 and 1943 by the Mussolini administration in fascist Italy. Italy was intended to implement racial discrimination and segregation through these laws. Italian Jews and native African citizens of the Italian colonial empire were the principal victims of the racial laws. A 17 November 1938 decree numbered 1728 constituted the initial and preeminent racial legislation. It prohibited Jewish authors' writings, limited Italian Jews' civil rights, and kept them out of higher education and public office. Further legislation deprived Jews of their property, prohibited them from traveling, and in the end stipulated that they would be imprisoned within their own country, just like political prisoners. The Race Manifesto of 1938, that is, the Manifesto of Racial Scientists, as it was often called, declared the superiority of the Aryan race and laid the groundwork for racial laws. A protracted newspaper campaign and the earlier 1938 release of the Manifesto of Race preceded the enactment of the racial laws. This was signed by National Fascist Party members and scientists alike. The racial laws of 1938, where the legal rights and social involvement of Jews and other non-Aryans in Italy were limited by these laws, which were passed in July 1938. These measures encompassed prohibitions against Jews entering diverse vocations, including journalism and teaching, as well as quotas based on race in universities and colleges. The laws of 1939, where another legislation was implemented in an effort to isolate and diminish the Jewish community. They placed more limitations on Jews, such as making them use separate facilities and forbidding them from getting married to non-Jews. The laws of 1933, where the administration imposed additional stringent measures, including seizing Jewish property and assets and deporting Jews to concentration camps. Mussolini's fixation with his own cult status stems from his ambition to use his fascist government to influence and dominate the people of Italy. His self-portrayal as a strong and unfailing leader was achieved through speeches, myths, and propaganda. He came up with a catchphrase that said he was always right and commanded allegiance and submission from his adherents. The first political figure to methodically apply the methods of theater, visual arts, and mass media to a customized form of government was Mussolini. This action formed an element of the strategic plan to establish himself as a formidable and essential leader. He was able to create a widespread cult of personality in the fascist Italy he founded through skillfully designed propaganda, the dissemination of myths, portraying him as deistic in character, and complex, enthralling speeches. He got rid of any symbolic ideas of Il Duce as a performer and instead told the story of his life as a real live stage reviewer, impresario, dramatist, and critique. His speeches were iconic. Mussolini delivered theatrical presentations that inspired faith. He used dramatic gestures and hand gestures, as well as noticeable shifts in the pitch and tone of his voice in a pantomimic and liturgical oratory. That the crowd does not have to know, it must believe, was his belief. Mussolini maintained affiliations with notable individuals, including Luigi Pirandello, Gabriele D'Annunzio, and George Bernaccio. Fascist Italy's theatrical programming was influenced by these associations. Mussolini attempted to write plays. He wrote Campo di Maggio, Villafranca, and Cesare, 3 historical dramas in collaboration with Gioacchino Forzano. His plan included several plays in order to portray himself as a strong, all-important leader. Stage censorship was managed by Mussolini. This gave him the ability to control the storyline and ensure that the theater was utilized as a vehicle for the propagation of fascist ideology. In his role as an impresario, Mussolini planned and oversaw public entertainment, particularly plays. He was able to direct the content and style of these performances thanks to his role, which elevated his cult reputation even higher. His plan included several acts in order to portray himself as a strong, all-important leader. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Sundeep August. This is the Sundeep August Show. Understanding Mussolini's cult is essential to comprehending Italy in the 20th century and, more broadly, the significance of charisma in contemporary history. His individual charisma predates both the establishment of fascism and the formalization of group charisma via the movement and personality cult. His fascist administration successfully used a cult of personality to manipulate and dominate the Italian people. Through strategic manipulation of theatrical concepts and theatrical maneuvers, Mussolini successfully cultivated an extensive cult of personality within the fascist Italy he instituted. This methodically insightful technique changed our perceptions of fascism in general. Thank you.
This is the Sundeep August Show.